Away we go. Okay, so welcome everybody to the Q&A session. Follow up to two Mikes and a Dan discussing the SMO fund. We have two Mikes, a Deb and a Dan, answering the questions that people are coming up against as they work through their proposals.
And we have people on the line today. This is an interactive session.
Mm-hmm. We do.
So that means that people can talk to us and we can answer questions, and we can also steer this more as a peer learning, because I'm sure as people are doing your proposals that they're also having some suggestions that might be helpful for people as well.
So less of a banter rant and more of a conversation.
Exactly.
Going for you.
And we have some questions that people ask.
Is everybody who's on the call on, we can see them up here, or there are also people calling in on the phone?
No, you can see them all here. We got
That's a person who's
folks here, and this is a phone in right here.
Super.
So we've got 4 people on the call.
Okay, that's enough for a conversation. Maybe before we start, do we want to just ask people, how is it going with your proposal writing? Do any of you want to just throw in a comment or two about whether or not you're finding the procedure easier than past proposals? If you've never written another one and it's your first one, how are you finding it to work with this format, this idea of a preliminary proposal intake? If anybody wants to, even if you want to type in, that's fine too. We'll just get a feel for whether or not you're finding it a real challenge or whether it's okay. And while they're typing in the fear of that dreaded radio silence, Dan, what we can give a little bit of background on why it actually does look like that. I don't know if why we have a preliminary proposal intake, what the theory is here.
We could do a bit of an overview in terms of where, what are we talking about and why are we doing this.
Okay, so the idea with the preliminary proposal intake is actually coming from our sector, asking government to slow down on the need for really lengthy proposal intakes, because it can take upwards of a month of somebody working on a proposal. When you worked on the proposal, the MNCH proposal, that took a long time.
Right? It was, I think it was only open for a similar amount of time, maybe. But it was just, it was nonstop, it was late nights, and it took a lot of work. Granted, we were doing a consortium effort, so it was collaborating among, I want to say 7 organizations. But it's still something that, prepare for it, it's going to be a lot of work.
Yeah. So the idea this time was to make that so that, because a lot of groups are not going to get through the call, or they're not going to be successful, rather than waste their time, which collectively represents a lot of months of work in our sector. We were adamant that there were other ways of doing this, that other funders have come up with the idea of a preliminary proposal, see if your idea is basically sound before you go through the trouble of writing all of the details and doing all of the assessments. So for people that are writing the proposal right now, obviously your proposal is just a sound bite for what you will have to write later on. That's the idea.
A lot of it seems to be showing your thinking. How have you thought this through in terms of gender analysis, environmental analysis, human rights analysis, and then you'd be really required to sort of show the details in your main proposal.
Yeah, hence the emphasis on the theory of change. So we may not talk forever. We'll just talk we have some questions that people have sent in, but we're super curious. Did we get any responses on how things are going there?
Hi, this is Tracy DeGraff. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Hi, Tracy.
Hi. So I'm hearing things in and out. Sometimes if I've missed something, just forgive me there. I've been working on GAC proposals for many, many years, and this is the first time, obviously, that I've done a prelim proposal. I'm finding it just as arduous, actually. If not, in the end, it seems like it's going to be more, because I feel like there's so much pressure to get those. We're trying to get the same points of information in a compressed format. So we want to make sure, obviously there's a lot of pressure on how we're linking to the feminist policy, how we're linking to this, that I'm putting just as much work and time into designing this proposal to make sure that I hit all those pressure points as I am to a full proposal, because you're really covering off on all the same components.
Yeah, I hear you. And also every word has to count when there's only 15 pages. So
exactly, yeah.
It can be harder to write concisely and to write well and to the point than it is to write a little bit longer where you've got a bit more time to explain yourself. I totally understand that. Yeah.
And so the theory of change, I heard you mention that. I'm feeling like that is almost the center point on this proposal versus past it may have been the RBM and their PMF, whereas the theory of change seems to be where you can get to say it all those important, what is the execution of your program. So there you actually canceled out. Maybe you can elaborate or focus a little more on that too.
Okay, so we can take a little bit more a look at what is a theory of change. Maybe try to play with one a little bit in real time here. What other comments do we have about this process? How are people doing? It says, going well for us, struggling with the quick time frame, the application proposal itself, support from BCCIC, etc. Great, so that's nice. By the way, we have a following, Dan, for the two. We have something like 125 people or something that watched that video, which is way more than we thought. So we decided that that was a good thing, that people found it useful, and that was the idea behind doing this workshop today. But maybe I can also tell you about some opportunities, because you have until the 21st to get your proposal in, and on the 15th, which is Monday, the 11th, on December the 11th, it's December the 11th, yeah, Karina is nodding. December the 11th, there will be a special session that the Intercouncil Network will put on with a woman named Karen Craggs, who is an expert on feminism and has just done a bunch of feminism workshops in terms of how the Feminist International Assistance Policy works, with some very specific ideas on how you could incorporate that kind of thinking into your proposal. So that will be done on behalf of all of the councils in Canada, open to everybody across the country, and it will be next Monday, and it's in the form of a webinar. So if you're in the middle of trying to figure out how feminism will work in your policy, in your theory of change, or in your proposal, and you have specific questions, don't hesitate to fire them to me or Dan or Deborah, anybody here at BCCIC, and we'll make sure that she gets a chance to see those questions ahead of time, because that way she can cater her workshop as well as she can towards the kinds of questions that are coming up around trying to incorporate that into your theory of change. There's that opportunity, and then we have this opportunity today to answer questions. And then if you're not aware of it, there is a questions page. Now the portal shut down access to be able to ask more questions, but there were quite a few questions that were asked, and many of the people in the councils put in questions to make sure that questions were asked. So if you go through those questions, you'll see that you've got access to the answers that everybody got in the entire country, and it's certainly worth reading. Those the answers to those questions, like how do I open the PDF, etc., to be able to get in and answer the questions.
And you know, I think a year ago or so, they revamped the portal and how to do the applications, and they had held a webinar on that where they walked us through step by step how to do it. I can try to locate that. I think they must have recorded it and posted it later, so I can try to find that and make it available as well. Which
reminds me, there's also one other webinar worth watching, and that is the Canadian Council for International Cooperation held a webinar last week, which you can get at through our website. And that webinar is it had experts from environment, from the gender equity, and different departments in Global Affairs Canada speaking to how do you do a preliminary proposal. So they weren't allowed to talk about the call for proposals, this particular call, because the webinar was organized prior to this call coming out. So the idea was that they would just talk in general, how do you apply to Global Affairs Canada? And so they talk in very general terms, but it's actually worth listening to, because they actually talk about theory of change, and they talk about the latest thinking of what they're wanting to see for a proposal.
Yeah, so there's those opportunities to answer those questions. And looks, do we get another?
Can you read that for me?
I read that shot. This says your previous video was really helpful. We've decided to wait until next year as we have current 5-year funding for the next few years. We don't think we would be able to get our partners organized in time to adjust to the new agenda. And that was A, and B would land up having overlapping projects which would tax our partners. I'm here as the new board member who hasn't filled out any applications, so I am trying to bring myself up to speed for next year's intake.
Well, that's good thinking, because to be honest, you're better off putting in a really good proposal next year. than trying to chase the timeline in this year's proposal, which is December 21st. And my guess is that there will be quite a few pretty good proposals coming in this year, but there'll be even more next year because people will have had more time to prepare. Therefore, it's going to have to be even better next year. The competition will probably be much stiffer. So good for you for making that decision and trying to not tax your southern partner. Because keep in mind that these things also, we've noticed this as well, it has an impact on your southern partner to suddenly have to respond to all these questions and planning and all that. And sometimes if you're doing that in a compressed window, it is hard on your southern partners as well. So this is the challenge of writing proposals and not having the proposal writing actually be negative, have a negative impact in the community.
And it's sounding like this is a bit more arduous than we'd hoped as well, and especially with the time frame, even though it is supposedly a preliminary proposal. So that's something to maybe allow more time for and be more prepared for. It's not something you can just whip up.
Yeah, and the RBM part. By the way, the RBM handbook, I noticed that the recent version, so results-based management has been around for, I don't know, since, for as long as I can remember, but it sort of took off really big time in the 1990s with an RBM branch and everything. And it's gone through different versions. And this is something that people need to know if you've been around for quite a while and you used to do RBM a certain way, that what happens is people are sitting around in Ottawa and they're doing RBM and they have to actually justify, the fact that, I shouldn't say this, but you have to kind of justify that things are changing, you're staying up to speed and on the latest development. So if you read the new version, they specifically talk about theory of change in the handbook. So it's really important not to go to an older version because outputs have changed and inputs have changed. They've changed the definitions of those things over the years, and it can be confusing because they're using jargon. So it's important that if you're using the jargon, you're using it in the correct way. And they do outline it very well. The other one, too, that I can maybe just throw in as a suggestion, if you're at this point and you're working on your logic chain, is that they have some very good templates for the kind of language that they would like to see. And the reason is that the language, like you'll often see ultimate outcome statements start out with the words like enhanced or improved. And if you follow, it can feel like you're plagiarizing in a sense, right? That you're plagiarizing the sentence structure, but I would feel free to plagiarize the sentence structure in terms of the type of the way in which the sentence is set up, because it's showing them that you actually are familiar with why an ultimate outcome statement usually starts out with the word enhanced, and often enhanced capacity to blah, 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 right? So these are that logic chain is something that you absolutely must go through, and the handbook is an excellent. It's not that long a read. You can read through it and get through most of it, and then you can practice copying it or practice copying the theory to get something done. So where else are we? Any other comments, or we're going to dive into some of the questions?
Might as well dive into the questions. I mean, it sounds like you're outlining some really good resources, like the webinar recordings, the RBM manuals that exist for getting questions answered. And we also are going to try and be a bit of a resource ourselves. Once again, with the old disclaimer alert, this is just BCCIC opinion.
Yeah, that's pretty important. We always repeat that, because it is, even if we wrote a proposal last year, you put all that effort in NCH and so on, it still doesn't mean that we would be successful or you would be successful. It's just all opinion. It's all just opinion. Yeah.
So we've got a few questions that people have sent in ahead of time. We can start with those, Mike. And
let's do it.
While we're doing that, I just invite people to type in other questions that come up for you or that have come up so far, and we'll try and get to those as well by the end. Yeah,
and also any comments, or if you want to share, please share your knowledge, because this is the value, right? Is if people can share, how are you getting through this proposal writing? What are some of the tricks that you've got up your sleeve around writing a good proposal? And that's all welcome.
All right, so let's kick it off. The first question was for organizations that are registered Canadian charities in Canada, proposal applicant, but are also the implementing organization. For example, they're registered as an NGO in the implementing country. Would we list our implementing country NGO on the partner sheet?
That's a good question. So in order to qualify as a local partner, the organization needs to be local. And the way you prove it's local is that it's incorporated locally. So if you're incorporated in Canada and you're trying to pretend that you're working in Bolivia and you're the local partner, that ain't gonna fly. So you'd have to be, let's just take an example. I don't know, you're Save the Sky organization Canadian branch, and you have a Save the Sky organization Bolivia branch. If the Bolivian branch has a local board of directors, it's clearly incorporated in Bolivia, and it is run as a bona fide organization in Bolivia, And they will check this as well in terms of all proposals these days that I know of, certainly all the last proposal intakes. They usually go to the mission country where you're working. So they'll go to the mission in Bolivia and say, hey, is this a bona fide local organization? And the mission will check it out. Go, yeah, Save the Sky Bolivia is bona fide. They've been around for 10 years. They're legit. Mm-hmm. Because what they're looking for is they don't actually want you to set up shop in another country, pretend you're a local partner, and then pay yourself.
Yeah,
that's not the idea, right? And it gets complicated in this if you've got an organization that is essentially an international NGO that has headquarters in different countries, because you're not theoretically partnering with yourself, and they're going to watch for that. So you would want to make sure that you're a bona fide locally registered organization.
And if you do have essentially just a local branch in a different country, could you then list your partner as the local community? Is there any opportunity to do that?
No, I don't think. I personally think if you're not actually there and working as a local partner organization, then you're going to have to find a local partner. The idea is this, very simple idea. If and when you pull out, will there be somebody there to sustain the results of your project over time? Okay. So if you pull out, and that means that your partner is also pulling out, right? Because you're the Save the Sky organization, everybody's pulling chop, going home, then who's left? And that's the idea behind local partnership, is that there's somebody there to continue with these results over time. So it's the sustainability question. And also local ownership, because remember that the Paris Declaration is all about this. The Paris Declaration in Canada, we try to follow the recommendations of the Paris Declaration, which is this, and the concept is called beneficient-led or recipient-led programming, meaning that the people in the country lead their own process of poverty reduction. And by the way, one trick you can use here in terms of proving that whatever your theory of change is, opinion, again, total opinion. But almost every country these days that is on the ODA list has done what's called a needs assessment, NEED assessment, or a poverty reduction strategy. And in the poverty reduction strategy, it will list the way in which the country itself is designing its own sustainability or poverty reduction. So let's say you went to you might go to Peru, and you'll notice that water and water management is big. And so then the country has identified it as big. Not Canada. Canada didn't identify it. The country identified it. And what you can do, you can also go to the Global Affairs Canada webpage, and you can look up and search through the bilateral section. So this isn't partnership branch. This is the bilateral branch. So you'll go to a geographic branch, like the Americas branch or the Africa branch, right? And you can go and look for the country program framework. It's called that, or it'll be called very similar to this. And it will list what Canada's approach is in that country. And that's going to give you some really good clues as to whether or not your theory of change and your way of going about doing a proposal is fitting in with how Canada wants to work with that country, and how that country has previously identified how it wants to do development work. So you're showing that you're aligning with everybody in your theory of change and in your country. And that's actually kind of important, because the missions are going to look at your proposal and go, well, it's fitting in with country X's needs assessment. And yes, it's fitting in with what they want to do with forestry or women or whatever it happens to be.
So it's in your interest to show that line.
Yeah.
Yeah, and with the caveat that I have not seen the new, the most recent preliminary call. So I haven't read through it and seen how extensive it is. In the portal in the past, when you're going through the application process, you are asked at some point how the work of your partner country aligns with Canada's work program in those countries. So it's worth thinking about sooner rather than later.
So just to come back to the question, if you are going to list essentially a branch of your organization as a local partner, it has to be demonstrably a local partner in terms of having its own board, its own.
That's my understanding. That's my understanding. Yeah. Disclaimer. But I think that's how I've seen it in the past. Is you really.
So there was a question about, say, Austin, Canada versus Austin, Bolivia, and if they're incorporated differently within the different countries and have their own boards and stuff.
Yeah, along those lines.
And I think you're okay. I believe that's kosher, or it's legit.
And if that hasn't answered your question, you can also type in and kind of get some more clarification.
Yeah. What is not sometimes where it gets really kind of weird is if you're an international development organization with an international board of directors and you're working in Bolivia, that's not really a local partner. Now you're an INGO, an INGO, right? And INGOs are not the same as local partners.
Mm-hmm.
So the only thing you can do in a case like that is you can list the INGO as a kind of a third party partner. Then you can show that by having them involved, you're leveraging your technology transfer meaning simply your ability to do something, something that you're offering and putting on the table.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not always technology, it might be a way of doing things or capacity development or something along those lines. It's complicated, and it's worth doing a little bit of research if you fall into one of these kind of shady areas, not shady, but like gray areas. Gray areas, yeah. What we had other questions.
Yeah, well, this is kind of might be related to the first one. We just I don't think we've covered this already, but coming back to the first question, if we can list the implementing country NGO as our partner, should it be listed under? Should you be listed under the umbrella organization column? Our Canadian, this is brackets, our Canadian charity is considered the parent organization of our implementing country NGO, and we're registered as an international NGO in our implementing country. Is that kind of what you were?
Okay, I see what's going on. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So they're a Canadian organization, and let's say they go to, let's use Bolivia again just for fun. Mm-hmm. They go to Bolivia and they have, and let's say they're called, I don't know, whatever they call it, Save the Sky organization in Canada. And there's Save the Sky organization in Bolivia.
Mm-hmm.
And in Bolivia, Save the Sky Canada is considered an international NGO. So it's listed with the government as being, because sometimes what happens is some governments require NGOs and CSOs to register with the government before you're allowed to do work in the country. So for example, in Nigeria, for me to go work in Nigeria, I would have to go to Nigeria, register with the government as a bona fide, allowable NGO to do work in that country. And this is a big deal. In some countries, this is a big deal, like Ethiopia.
Ecuador.
Yeah, it's a big deal. So again, if you're brand new to this, you've never worked, you've got to go work this out. You got to go to the country, figure out, can you even work there? And then when you do work there, in what capacity? Usually you're doing it in partnership. In this case, if you're listed as an international NGO, the listing of what Bolivia thinks is not important in this case to your eligibility to be a Canadian CSO. To be a Canadian CSO to work with Canada, you just have to be registered in Canada, right, as a Canadian NGO, Canadian CSO, which means either federally or provincially. There's two different ways you can register in Canada, either as a provincial CSO or as a federal CSO under the Federal Societies Act.
Okay.
Two different concepts. As long as you got one of those numbers, like a business number, you're fine. Or a charitable number, even better. Because if you're a charitable number, you have charitable status. You just go ahead and you're fine.
There you go. Okay, does anybody else on the line want to weigh in on that before we move on to the next question?
Are we down a rabbit hole too? Like, is this way too nuanced a rabbit hole? Are we okay?
We've got other questions if no one else wants to chip in.
Yeah, don't feel free to type questions, you guys. Otherwise, we'll just end up not talking.
Yeah, or we'll end up talking.
Or we'll just talk about things that make no sense to anybody.
Okay, so I'll move on to the second question since anyone typing in yet. But the third question. This is a question about Bolivian and Brazilian partnerships. So we are hoping to work in Bolivia, funnily enough, with Brazilian partnership. I'm wondering if costs of the Brazilian contribution are eligible, mostly operational with HR as in kind. So are contributions from the Brazilian partner eligible to include as
right
contributions?
Okay, so my understanding is no. That because this is a bit complicated because we have 3 countries involved that I can see. But if I understand that correctly, the person wants to go to work in Bolivia, and they have a Brazilian partner that's going to come in and help them work in Bolivia. And so they want to know, does the Brazilian partner's contribution constitute or qualify as under the cost sharing as the 5%?
Okay.
The answer to that is no, from my understanding. The idea behind the 5% is that that's the Canadian organization that's contributing and showing up because it's a contribution agreement. So you're actually showing the Canadian government when you enter into a contribution, not a grant. So keep in mind, there's different ways that the Canadian government can give you money. One is they just give you a grant and you take the money and spend it. Done. That's great. Most of these are not going to be that. They're going to be a contribution agreement. meaning that the Canadian government is going to contribute some money and you're going to contribute some money. And together in partnership, you're going to go over to country X or Y and do something. Now, if another country gets involved that's not Canadian, right, like Brazilian or something, or an international NGO or whatever, they fall under the third party category. They're like a third party that's coming in to help you. So they're leveraged. It's not a bad thing. It's a good thing because it's showing everybody that even more people are involved. But it doesn't qualify for the original reason why we went for contributions from Canadians, which was to show that Canadians, it's like when the government says, we'll match it 3-to-1. They're looking for enough interest from Canadians that when the Canadian government also supports it, you're supporting things that Canadians want to support. So there's a tsunami in another country, everybody wants to put money in, the government goes, geez, a lot of Canadians are interested, so we will throw our support at 3-to-1. And it's proof that Canadians want this thing, right? And that's what you're trying to do with this contribution agreement, is show that there are people in your organization in Canada that are going to contribute to this. And the Canadian government's going to contribute, and that's Canada's contribution to ODA. Third party comes in from Brazil.
It's not a Canadian
It's not a Canadian contribution,
Okay.
but it's good. So definitely mention it because it means even more people are interested and you're leveraging the Canadian contribution. So now we go to why don't we just talk a bit about the in-kind? Because I think I noticed in the application, I read quickly, we're not actually applying. So for those of you that are applying and you have some hints because you're doing it, let us know what is unique about this application. But when it comes to in-kind contributions, there are some rules around that, and people should understand those rules. You can't just make this stuff up and go, we're going to do 5%. At the same time, don't underestimate what might be an in-kind contribution, because in-kind contribution, so first of all, a cash contribution is you're going to take money, you're going to get $500,000 from the Canadian government, and you're going to put in cash as your contribution. 5%, that's $25,000. Right? So you're going to just go raise $25,000. You're going to put it in the bank. The entire project will be worth $525,000. That's how you're going to do the math, right? Or it's going to be worth 500. Sorry, that's exactly wrong. It's going to be worth 500, and the Canadian government is going to put in $475,000, and you're going to put in 25 because it's 5%.
Let's get to that.
Got that? Sorry.
So not additional,
not additional.
Just to bring up that 5%.
To bring it up to 500. So you can actually ask the Canadian government to put in 500, and you're going to put in. You can actually go a little higher if you wanted to, right? So that you get the full 500 out of the Canadian government. If you did the math right, your whole project's going to have to be worth 528 or something. You follow me on that? Yeah. You should do the math. Do it on your calculator. Somebody can do it.
Better than us.
Yeah, better than I can in my head.
So one way is the cash contribution.
Cash
what
contribution.
About in-kind?
Yeah, in-kind contribution. And again, by the way, the cash contribution is way, way sexier than the in-kind to them. It means that's real. It's measurable. It's bomb-proof because you're putting in cash. If you're going to claim the entire thing in kind, first of all, I'd really rethink that. Come up with some cash because you want to have some cash. If you can't come up with $5, there's something wrong here. So I would put up some cash if you can. And then on your in-kind, make sure it's provable. And the other one is, don't think that just 5% is what you have to, that's it. It's not leveled at 5. You could make your project look a little bit more like it has more popularity or horsepower behind it by increasing the contribution. The only thing that you need to be careful of here is that later on when you sign the contract, okay, you said you're going to come up with 30%. You're going to be bound by that. So the safest thing you can do is stick to the minimum, which is 5%, but it's not as attractive at the proposal intake stage. Later on when you get the proposal, 5% is easy. You only had to come up with 5% and you're covered. But if you sign 30 and you claim 30 now, they'll hold you accountable to the 30 and they won't give you the money unless you show up with your 30. You see what I'm getting at? This is pretty important at this stage. So you want to actually assess your ability to come up with the funds and the in-kind to the absolute best that you can.
So how do you calculate that actually?
Okay, so in-kind, there's a bunch of rules around this around the Canadian Revenue Agency. And so an in-kind contribution, let's say you're going to donate your car. Okay, well, first of all, that's really hard because, what's your car worth? So you actually have to prove market value on goods. And that can be quite complicated. Now, some market value on goods is very easy to prove, right? Because it has a value. But let's say you're gonna do a big drive for medical equipment. You're gonna get a bunch of crutches and hospital equipment. It's all gonna be worth X number of dollars. You're not allowed to determine that yourself. You're gonna have to show some way that was determined that's fair market value, and it has to be provable. And the problem with this is when they come and they audit your project. And by the way, anybody who's going for larger amounts of money, like if you're gonna go for the full 2 million, guarantee you're gonna get an audit. You can guarantee you're gonna be audited. Now, any of these projects could be audited, but it's the audit you wanna think about when you're doing all these calculations, because the auditor will come and they'll wanna go, okay, well, how did you prove your in-kind? And the major one here that happens where you can really up your in-kind quickly is through human resources, through people's volunteer time. Because let's say you're gonna have somebody go and they're gonna go down and they're gonna help with the project for 6 months in Uganda, right? So then it's kind of fun because you can go, oh, well, the person's a nurse, right? And what's the nurse worth? And you take the Canadian value of a nurse, right? Which you can find. I mean, or you take the Canadian, even if the person is just doing general labor or something, you can still put a value on this.
At least minimum wage.
At least minimum wage, right? And you can go to Imagine Canada and places and you can find the average value of volunteer. What you're going for here is a paper trail, right? Some provable paper trail that allows you to show that the time the person's putting in is worth a certain amount of money. And now here you also have to remember, there's a couple other clues. It gets a bit complicated, but you're gonna have to remember, you can't kind of exaggerate this and say they worked 7 days a week and they were there for 6 months and therefore they're worth millions, because there's all these other rules in your general contracting conditions that you're only allowed to work 6 days a week when overseas. You can only work 37.5. The point is you could do a little bit of investigation, or you could just come up with a nice provable number based on some kind of a contract, right? Like we know that QSO, for example, values cooperants that go overseas at a certain price, and they have a provable number, and you could say if that's what the cooperant is worth. And you can get your numbers up really quick. Like you could just have one volunteer go for a year. You're laughing. It's easily worth 50 grand.
And it sounds like the key here is to have proof of how you valued them. So like going with the national average for what the salary or the hourly rate is for that person, and then also to track it. So you can actually prove that they have worked those hours either through timesheets or at least a contract.
Yeah, like you will have to do in-kind sheets, right? So now this is all much later in the program. You have to worry about all this stuff later, right? But right now you're trying to scramble to get your in-kind contribution in and figure out how much. What I'm getting at here is you don't want to blow that up way too high, and you don't want this to be too low. You want to find the sweet spot that's actually real for what you plan on doing. So let's say well, we are going to send 2 people, and we know they're going to go for at least 6 months. So now you're getting a really good idea quickly that you can put that in with confidence. Don't exaggerate this stuff, because later on you'll get stuck, right? And also it's not going to look real. So don't go and say, well, we're going to come up with $500,000 in kind. That's going to be pretty hard to do.
You're creating more work for yourself.
Yeah, you're creating. And also, by the way, we advocated and advocated and advocated on your behalf to get these numbers, to get 5%, because we want it to be low. We don't want it to be huge. Like some previous proposals, you had to have 30% in-kind contribution. That's pretty hard for a small organization to do that. That's not easy. So that blocked many organizations from being able to apply. For example, in the old ESDP program, I remember it was 25%, and it was even higher in the second and third years. So this is a pretty good ratio, and we want to be able to prove these numbers if we can really effectively.
Does anybody want to add anything to the discussion around in-kind? Anyone want to share their expertise from the call? Either just unmute yourself and speak, or you can chat.
Also, make sure this is still interesting, and because we can go down rabbit holes of in-kind if we're not careful.
Yeah. We've got a few other questions that we can
do we?
go
Okay.
this too. So
All right. Okay.
Unless anybody wants to chip in on.
Tap into theory of change stuff.
Theory of change, yeah. So let's keep going then. We'll keep going. And if they want to, don't feel shy. Just jump in on the show here, and we'll hit the dong if you think it's just opinion. Yeah. Great.
So we've got looking at partnerships again and also contributions. So are costs of local partners considered part of the 20% limit in subcontractors or part of the core eligible costs?
Now, those are direct project costs. So your local partner, so the question is, I'm working with Project X, they're the local partner, bona fide, they're the local village association of women and girls, okay? Are they subcontracting? No, they're not. When you're working with them, those are direct project costs. Subcontracting is a 20% rule, which is essentially there for the following reasons. is that what Canadian groups do is they say, oh, we're going to do this project, right? And then they list all the people and the reasons why they can do the project. And then as soon as they get the money, they just subcontract it out to somebody else. And it's like, well, why are they doing the project? It's another Canadian group doing it. So they stopped this. They said the maximum you can go and subcontract the project to somebody else to accomplish it is 20%. So 20% Canadian subcontracting. So that's essentially who's doing your job as the Canadian partner. You can't let somebody else do your job.
They don't want to go outsourcing.
Some ways we've seen this play out in the past is if on the Canadian side you bring in someone for specific workshops or trainings or perhaps monitoring and evaluation later on, kind of skills that might not be part of your core team or Canadian organization skills.
And this is tricky too, by the way, because you might actually to bring in a consultant to do a workshop on feminism or something. You might not have that background in your organization. So you build it into your proposal. If it gets too high, they're going to go, what they're essentially going to say is, well, you don't have the expertise to pull the project off because you should be able to at least do 80% of the work. That's why they're contracting you as a Canadian small and medium-sized organization. So when going back in the proposal to where you give the rationale on previous experience, that's going to be key, that you can show previous experience in what you're doing. By the way, I noticed something very interesting in this proposal, and I don't know, this is again, this is serious opinion. Right? This is serious, really serious opinion only. But what I noticed is that they actually ask you in the call, is your project innovative? And then you're supposed to tell them how innovative it is. Now be careful here because there's an innovation fund, right? And if you get to be too innovative or it's too risky, they might just say, this doesn't belong in the development impact window. This belongs in the innovation window. So you might be applying for development impact funds thinking it's good to say how great, innovative, and totally avant-garde your project is. That's kind of a trick question because because it says on the bottom, it says tip even. Where's that thing? Somebody read it. It actually says tip. Yeah, there's an innovation branch in global affairs, and you'll find literature on what constitutes innovation, a definition from the Canadian government. If you go to the actual form, no, you got to go to the form. Yeah, this form.
We're sharing the form.
Oh, good. Let's go down then, and you'll see where it says tip, and they're giving you a healthy tip here.
Right at the bottom, or?
I think it's go to where the part where we're talking about innovation. Is your project innovative? 15 pages.
Keeps going.
Rationale, wait, slow down. Innovation, right there. Okay, so here we see innovation is any solution that has potential, blah, blah, blah. And then you put the thing on there, great. And now it says tip, not every project needs to present innovation as part of its design. If this is the case, write the words proven approach. Now that's my point. The development impact window, the 79 million, from my understanding, was supposed to be for proven approaches. And if you wanted to innovate, they would steer you to the innovation fund, which Manitoba will run. So I look at that and I go, well, if I was filling that out, I'd be pretty tempted to go proven approach, right? And then prove that your approach, that your past experience, later on when it has the experience section, you'd want to say, well, yeah, we got tons of experience doing this. We did it with women and girls over here, and we did it with women and girls over there. And you might be innovating a little bit, or whatever, but if the thing's a brand new concept, you never worked with them before and you want to do something strange, they might go, that's not the window. And they'll steer your proposal somewhere else. So be careful. That's a little, now again,
that one.
Serious opinion, because I could be wrong. Maybe they do want innovation and it's just a trick, but I think the tip is kind of there.
Yeah, it seems to be swaying
Tip
direction. It's like, sure, there's innovative, but not too
innovative. So here's where you're on your own. This is where
innovative.
Yeah, exactly. Provenly innovative. You're totally on your own on this one and how you want to interpret that. How about that for major disclaimer so nobody can come back and say, hell,
going back to the subcontractor thing, a safe place to think, and you won't have to think about this till later, but a safe place to subcontract out is always the language stuff, whether it's an interpreter or a translator. It seems to work for
Right. Yeah.
Okay, so
where are we now?
Another question, and once again, if you want to add anything, just speak up or type in. And we're going to move to the next question, and this is a good one. Is there a limit to the size of the local partner? This is a small to medium-sized organization fund, but does it just apply to Canadian organizations? Or?
No. That's the small and medium-sized criteria is for Canadian organizations only. And so you could work with the largest organization in the South if you want. The question will come up, which is this. If you were working with a super high capacity organization, I don't know, let's dream one up. Call it it's massive. It has 20,000 members and they're fantastic. And they're just
Pan-African
super innovation people. And you come along and you're a small organization, the big question is going to be, what are you doing for that? You're supposed to be providing technology. You're supposed to be providing some advantage, some kind of way in which Canadians are helping. You might be more of a hindrance to that group, right? So they'll be looking at that going, is this a good match? You know, are you actually a suitable match in terms of capacity? Because you might be actually such a pain to that group, which already knows what it's doing, that they could have just funded that group.
Yeah.
They just fund them through bilateral, right? Because you're not actually offering anything. So you're going to have to try to match your size and your capacity with the size and the capacity needs of the local partner. You know, why are they working with you? That's a good question. And actually, I wouldn't underestimate this question. There's really a lot of small and medium-sized organizations out there. One of the questions sometimes is, are you actually providing anything? You know, because some of these southern groups are fantastic. They're really good at their game. They don't need you, right? They need the money. So you're just a filter that's taking some money off to get to them. Maybe the money's better off flowing directly to them.
If you're not bringing anything else.
Yeah.
Okay, so last question, because we're getting close to the 11:45 time limit. I said the last question, and then we can open it up to wider questions, or if there's no other questions, we can look at theory of change.
Theory of change.
Great. So last question, on the website it states, among others, defining SMO, the consolidated revenue in your organization's financial statement is equal to or less than 10 million. This criteria seems too general. Are small organizations expected to possess equal to or less than 10 million? 0 is also less than 10 million.
Yeah.
So at the same time, before writing a proposal, we would like to know, if any, how much is required for small organizations to contribute to the expected project. And this is also referring to in cash or in kind.
Yeah. So that last question is really easy. You just take the amount and times it by 5%. So if you're going to do $1 million project, then you need to come up with 50,000.
Okay.
If you're going to do a $500,000 project over 2 years, you're going to come up with 25,000 over 2 years. That's 12,500 a year. Not that hard, right? I mean, I don't think you could do bake sales and do that, right? And you could. You actually could. You could probably do bake sales and do that, right? It's not that hard. But where you're getting in the bigger numbers, also keep in mind that we just talked about getting the ratio up. The previous question about the size of the organization, this is going to be the absorptive capacity question that they will look at. So they're going to look at your financial books. By the way, there are 3 types of financial statements that they're open. And this is good news, because they used to only let you had to have audited financial statements to qualify. And one of the things that we argued on your behalf, again, I just keep putting that out because it's important. We did actually argue for these things, was that you could come up with an audit review statement. So you can go to an auditor and not have a full set of books audited, because it's expensive for a lot of small groups. It's like $5,000, $6,000 minimum these days to get an audit done. And so you can just get a letter of audit review and put that in. And I noticed on this one, or you can even just put in your books. You can just put in your actual non-audited books. Yeah, you have to put in financial statements, but those can be self-produced. So that's my interpretation of that. And disclaimer again. Disclaimer one more time. But so ideally, they're saying in there, ideally they'd like the audited books. And so that means you put those 2 in. What they're going to do is they're going to look at your audited books, and they're going to see your fiscal size. And your fiscal size, or let's say you're a $50,000 organization, it's going to be kind of questionable whether you can handle $500,000. And I'll be honest on that one, that's actually pretty true. Like it's, you know, and also you can ask yourself, can you really absorb? Can you go from being $50,000 organization with no employees and no bookkeeper and no anything, and suddenly you're going to handle and you're going to ask for $1 million? Everybody's going to go, no. You're just going to go, this is not the right fund for you. So you might want to partner. In that case, you might want to partner with an organization that looks like it's more approaching the fiscal size that's appropriate. And on this one, I think a general rule, again, total opinion, but never exceed 2 to 1. I mean, personally, you just don't ask for more than doubling your budget.
Okay.
Because that would be a lot of growth. Like your growth curve is just they would go, oh, that's too much growth.
Too much risk.
Yeah, it's too much risk. And it's actually not that good. Sometimes too, even also the amount that you might be flooding your local partner with. That's another one too, is you can look at how much are you going to stress and burden your local partner to have to grow too quickly or to grow at a speed that they can't handle under the time frames and the constraints of the local conditions as well. And that's where the missions kick in, right? Because the missions are supposed to have their eyes on the ground. So these proposals go to the country mission. Mission people go, well, have we ever heard of this organization? Oh yeah, we've heard of them. One of the things you can do that's really clever too is you can actually get your local partner to visit the mission and get on their radar screen.
The Canadian mission.
Yeah, the Canadian mission. Just do a courtesy visit. Say, we want to do a courtesy visit, tell you who we are. And that way they know of who you are. And because your local partner might be actually very well known, but the Canadian mission didn't know about it. Mm-hmm. And then, so then, they do the phone calls. You ever heard of this group? Mm-hmm. It's like, yeah, we heard of it. And then that's how that works.
Yeah, in terms of kind of getting ready for the before or as part of the proposal, reaching out to missions, your partner reaching out to missions. And we're also chatting about kind of in order to help yourself maybe dust up your website a bit.
Yeah.
Make sure that's really up to date.
Because keep in mind that your organization, if you're small and medium, maybe they never heard of it in Ottawa. Mm-hmm. And so there'll be people going, well, is it a bona fide legitimate organization? So it's not hard to Google, right? They're going to Google you. So if they Google you, what are they going to see? And so if you've been claiming you've been working with women and girls for 15 years and on your web page there is nothing, that's going to be problematic. So I would suggest that if you are small and you've not heard of, that you make sure that your web page reflects what you're up to, especially if you're making claims on it. The other one too is that the background, they suggest in the proposal that there are background assessments that if you've got them and you've had them done,
like a third party
assessments.
Yeah,
those are bomber if you've got them and they're successful and they're decent. Definitely list it. Don't be shy on that, because that is a third person's opinion about whether or not you're doing any good work, right? And that can be really, really helpful for them to decide whether or not you're legit.
Yeah. Rock solid stuff.
Rock solid. Yeah.
Okay, so we're coming up on 10 minutes.
Yeah.
And I don't think we've had anything typed in yet, have we? I don't think there's been any typed in questions. So
are we okay? Or is this conversation interesting to you guys? Because we got to make sure we're interesting, otherwise we're boring.
Otherwise,
that would be bad.
What's the point?
Yeah.
I think if it's valuable, we should try to shift to theory of change unless there are other questions. And just scrolling through this preliminary submission, I don't know who made the comment about it doesn't look any less intensive than it doesn't. It looks like it's like a first application, because you're expected to do a logic model in this. And so I think an important thing when talking about your theory of change and thinking about it is you're going to have that in mind. Because you're going to I was going to originally say that you have to have it in mind for later when you submit the full application, but you have to know it now. And it's important to note the difference between theory of change and a logic model when you go through this right now, because it's even listed, there's a sentence on it in the application itself that a theory of change is not a narrative of the logic model. The content should be focused on the linkages and assumptions, not an explanation of the results themselves.
Yeah.
And ideally, it should be longer than 7 pages.
So we've got some questions coming in. Hopefully, then we can.
Then we'll try
theory of change.
The other thing is theory of change. We can go a long time about theory of change.
We
could do a whole webinar on it. Yeah.
And we can do this again next week.
We could if people think it's good. Yeah. Okay. Well, we'll dive and we'll see how many people view and look at it and responses we get from people on theory of change. And if we want, we can do an exemplary theory of change.
And this is new. This is as of last year when we redesigned the portal. Theory of change was not part of any of the calls for submission. So it's new to global affairs. So
maybe worth chatting about.
Okay,
so question coming in around, I have a quick question about the cost share table, if we have enough time. So I think we've got enough time. Who would like to jump say more about that either?
Do we unmute them or do they unmute themselves?
Yeah, that's me.
Okay.
Yeah, hi. So just if you do have time, it's just more of a logistics type question. On the application, that cost share section, there's a column for the global affairs contribution that we're requesting. That number, and then in the sort of information about the budget that we would submit later, they talk about how global affairs will contribute a percentage based on our cash that we contribute, as well as our volunteer in-kind, or our in-kind that we contribute. So that number there, the Global Affairs Canada contribution dollar amount, does that include the percentage that's coming from global affairs on those two categories, or is that on top of that?
Have a look at this.
Okay, so the way that, I'm not sure exactly what the question, but I know how the calculation is done. So why don't we just work on it that way? Let's
Okay.
say that you dream up a project. First thing is your project, the total cost of your project needs to be more than $500,000 and it needs to be under 2 million. So it can be any number. Let's go with 800 just for fun, okay? The total cost of your project is $800,000 and the way to do it is just to make up your budget. Forget about who's putting in what money. Just make up the budget as to why this project is going to cost $800,000. And then somebody have a calculator? Basically, once you've done that, you're going to say total cost of the project is 800, and you're going to be you're going to ask Global Affairs for 95% of that amount. Okay, so 95% of that is going to be 8 times 4 is 760, right?
860.
Yeah, I think it's 760,000, but let's check.
800,000 times 0.9, right?
0.95.
95.
95% is going to come. This is the minimum, 760. So these are the minimum numbers you're going to work with. So you have a total project 800,000. Global Affairs Canada's contribution will be 760, and you're going to have to come up with 40. So yours is 40. Okay. Now it gets a little more interesting in this because we can do this a little bit backwards because let's say you think your overall project is going to cost $800,000. Those are the real costs of your project. The actual real costs of doing your project with your direct partner. You're allowed to add 12% onto this, okay, as a overhead, as overhead. And that's to pay for your rent, your telephone, all the things that are not allowable. They're not eligible costs. And you can find out what eligible costs are because there's a guide in Global Affairs Canada to tell you which ones are eligible and which ones aren't. But essentially, this entire project is going to be worth 888, right? Isn't that the number? What's 12% of 800? I think it's 88, right?
800.
Nobody does it in the head math anymore.
No. 100.
Well, 10% is 80.
80 and 88 would be 88. Yeah, good. I was right. 88. 88. So 88%. So you're looking at $888,000 is going to be the actual total project. 800 is going to be Global Affairs Canada is going to kick in, right? And and you're going to have 88% over. The good thing is that when you do it calculates all this for you. But what you're going to have to think about is this 40. So now you got $40,000 over here. Sorry, yeah, which is cash and in kind. And the good news is that they didn't differentiate how much should be cash and how much should be in kind. You could theoretically do the entire 40 as in kind and never put a cent into this project. I'm telling you that's not that great an idea. I would try to go as high on cash as you theoretically can. So this is money that you could go out and raise through bake sales or whatever to come up with the 40,000. That might be a little bit high. So let's say you say to yourself, well, I'm going to do this 1525. I'm going to come up with $15,000 cash and I'm going to have $25,000 in kind. Those are pretty easy numbers. And then you can kind of, after that, you could say to yourself, actually, I want to give myself a little bit more advantage from all the other groups, and I'm going to increase it to 7%. Like, you only have to go to 6 and you're already ahead of the other groups. You're going to get a higher score. Just a little hint here, right? If you just hit 5, everybody else is hitting 5. If you go over 5, you suddenly are going to score higher on their matrix because you're putting in more. So geez, just go to 6 and you're still better off than 5, right? Does that make any sense? Yeah. Go to 10 and you're starting to look pretty strong, right? Et cetera, et cetera. So let's say you did 10%, you put in $80,000 for this whole thing. And you said you're going to raise $20,000 cash and 60 in kind. Not impossible numbers at all for this size and scope of an organization. Because you could raise 60 grand through 2 volunteers going down for 6 months each. You've already got 60 grand right there in kind, provable income. And the 20,000 in cash shouldn't be that hard to raise, right? In fact, another little trick. Okay, now this is a trick. And again, disclaimer again, big time. This is a big time disclaimer. But note that you are going to be able to get 12% overhead from the government, right? And that 12% is $88,000. 96. It's 96, I was wrong. 12% of 800 is 96. Sorry, I'm wrong. Bad. Okay, good. So you got $96,000 coming in out of $800,000 that's eligible overhead. But when you get that money later on, that's your money to do whatever you want with. They're not allowed to ask you a thing about that 12%. You're going to have to give them an auditable trail on everything to do with the 800, but the 96 is yours. You can go buy a Ferrari with it if you want. That's totally your money. Now note how that makes it a little bit safe for you, because if you wanted to put in $20,000, $25,000 cash, you could steal it from your overhead and say, that's how we got our money. You don't have to tell them where you got it. It's totally your business. Just a little trick. If you need to make your board feel safe with the numbers, right? You can say, look, we're going to get overhead. The only thing is that the overhead is real. That's your only overhead you have, right? So if you have overhead costs to run your organization, it's real. But some of the small and medium-sized organizations are laughing on this one because their efficiency is so much higher than the big organizations that have huge buildings and overhead and all these people. You're just a small volunteer-run organization. Maybe you only have 1 or 2 employees, or maybe you don't have any employees. Your overhead costs might be really low. Therefore, it's opening up your ability to get access to that cash to use it as part of your contribution. Just don't tell anybody that. That's what you do later on, right? You do that later on. I'm not suggesting it's a great idea for your sustainability. I think you're better off raising the money, showing where you raised the money, and blah, blah, blah. Does that answer your question? Was that helpful? Yeah? Especially for a small, if you're a super small or volunteer organization, you might want to think in more humble terms and think in trying to get your organizational in-kind and cash as high as you dare. Yeah, five more minutes. Well, I don't think we have time for theory of change. I mean, what we can do, 2 minutes. Yeah. I don't think we have time for theory of change other than to say, I think your key point, Deb, is the critical one, which is under theory of change, it's not the same as your logic model. The logic model is a description of the logic of your project. The theory of change is a description of how your organization believes the world changes, right? And those are 2 different concepts. So in your theory of change, you'll want to talk about, well, we believe that by going to Sierra Leone and working with women and girls in organic agricultural plots, that will change the world. And then you have to describe what are your assumptions because of this, because Sierra Leone is a post-conflict country, and if we work with women and girls, there's a village structure in which that will change this and change that, and patriarchy will.
I like the word linkages. I like to show linkages.
Linkages, yeah. So assumptions and risks and all those things become really important in the theory of change. In your actual for your actual logic model, the trick is to follow the language of how they outline it in the.
Yeah, the logic model will be if we implement or if we develop this many plots, we will see this output, which will lead to this outcome.
Yeah.
Right, that's all the language. So it's more of like a flow chart of how a specific activity will play out.
Yeah, the other one too, can we put in another, just a real careful thing here is, if you've been using a logic chain that somebody else, like the OECD, or let's say one of the European aid agencies, or if you've been using somebody else's logic chain, don't assume it's the same one as the results-based management one that the Canadian government uses. For example, there's 6 levels in the Canadian government one. They use outputs at the beginning of the chain, which lead to activity. So an inputs goes inputs, activities, outputs, immediate outcomes, intermediate outcomes, long-term impact. Ultimate outcome or long-term impact. And the long-term impact, actually, we could get into this a little bit. Yeah. Is it right there? Oh, good.
Well, okay.
There you go. We don't have enough time. And we're not going to do RBM right now, no matter how interesting it is.
There was mention of the theory of change on the last webinar that Global Affairs Canada held, and they recorded it, and so they do talk about from the official perspective.
They do. I think we can do something more meaningful. I think it's still something that's new to them in terms of innovative ways to define what your theory of change might be. So I think it is worthwhile. Maybe we can send some literature out on what we've done and then have a follow-up.
You know what we can do? Why don't we do this? Because we're going to have to end our rant for the day, which is we'll put this out again in a recorded format like we did the last one, and a lot of people watched the last one. This time we're inviting you, if you're watching this right now, look at the screen, is to write in the comments section, yes, we think we'd like you to do one on theory of change. Like, we need a bit of feedback to make sure we're not just broadcasting to, nothing. So if we could get some feedback from people saying, yes, we'd like you to do an interpretation exercise on theory of change, or even an interpretation translation exercise on RBM, sort of an RBM for dummies, that would actually be pretty good because the language they use, I've read some of their sentences in the application and I go, what are you talking about? I mean, honestly, of course it takes them 20 pages to explain how to write a 15-page proposal because they filled it with jargon. So for those of you that are going cross-eyed and you people on the phone, good for you for hanging in there and attempting this. I'm sorry to hear that it is actually more onerous for some of you, or as onerous as previous applications. We were hoping it wasn't as onerous, but I can see from going through it this morning quickly that it is actually looks pretty in-depth. So if we have to do one in the next day or two on theory of change.
Sounds like
there's interest already?
4 yes.
All right, well, we got 4 dedicated people, and you're on the line, so I'll tell you what, we'll do it. We'll schedule it, and we'll do an exercise. We'll try to do it in real time as if we're doing a real exercise. Like, we'll just pick anything, and we'll go through how would you develop a theory of change on it. We can also look at, which would be really fun, is we can look at what are some of the various developmental theories of change that are out there right now that are trendy ones, and different ones that people look at, right? So we could look at some of that, and we'll tackle that next time. On the rant, we got to have a name for our serious show. So far, it's been two Dans and or 2 Mikes and a Dan, and now we got Devin here, so it's Devin and Dan. It's a lot of D's. That's the other Mike. Goodbye, everybody. Thanks for joining us. Hopefully that was fun. Yeah. See ya.
Until next time.
Yeah. That's